Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'd like to talk about default data or domains of known good values, what have you, however you want to think of it. It's important that every database contain, or most every database, especially transactional databases, contain tables of known good values, domain level data. Sometimes that data is translated into multiple languages, whatnot. So we're connected again to my local instance here and into our local AdventureWorks database. And as I scroll down, like one of the first type tables that I find here is address type, right? So if I look at the data inside of the address type table, I see that I have 6 known good values, right? There's some goods here. I have no idea how those get referenced elsewhere, but it doesn't really matter. What we want to make sure of is that this data remains consistent from deployment to deployment to deployment, and that the project becomes the master system of record when we make these deployments and make these updates. You don't want this data drifting. It's important that this data doesn't drift. So first thing I'm going to do is hit the script button here. So I've done a right click on address type and chosen view data, right, which gave me this data. Now I can actually play with this data from here, but the first thing I'm going to do is script it. So here's the script that Visual Studio generates, and it tells me that it's allowing identity insert to be on for the address type ID is an identity column, and we'll see that, and we see that because it used the identity insert, right? It turns it on and off. And then we see the rest of the values that were here across the table as represented as an insert statement. I'm not going to go over insert statements. It's fine. You know, that's stuff that you can easily get out of the documentation. But let's say that somebody comes in and changes this to old stuff, right? So they randomly go in and change the data in the database. They've got access to do that. Well, that could easily mess up lots and lots of different things. Or somebody who's pulling a report that expects that name, because they're pulling things up by address type ID, they're expecting this name to be archive, not old stuff. It's going to blow the reports up, bad things are going to happen. So this is really important. This is very visible data typically, right, that people are expecting to see in their own certain way, in the way that they expect to see it. So we want to make sure that the data as it's represented here stays the data that exists in the table every time the database gets deployed. Now you could use a script like this, just like this, as it gets generated from the Visual Studio tool to do that, but in order to make that work, you'd have to wipe the data out every time. And that's not bad, but here's the real problem. The problem here is that you have business entity address that, if we look closer at it, it uses the address type ID inside a person as a foreign key. So if you delete all of these, then it orphans all of the address type IDs that are sitting out here. And it just does that for a second, but it's not good. And sometimes it won't let you. So even if you tried to delete everything out of there, because of this foreign key relationship, you really can't. So what do? Well, the answer is you use parts of this script to create a default data script. So I have an example of a default data script here. So the first thing I'm doing up here is I'm creating a table that looks a lot like my address type table, so that I can hold that data, right? So I'm going to say, hey, if my tempdb has an address type table, go ahead and drop it and then recreate it for me to make sure that it's clean. And then I'm going to use the values that were in this person address type table, right? And instead of trying to jam them right into person.address type, I'm going to put them into my address, my pound, my local temp table address type. Then I'll set identity insert on and run this merge. So this merge statement effectively says, hey, using person address type as a target and using address type, my temp table up here, as a source, match on the address type ID to address type ID. When those are matched, we're going to update the name, the row GUID, and the modified date to match my source. My source being, right, this address type table. When they're not matched, we're going to insert them. And when the destination table, the target table, is not matched by the source, then delete it. Delete that row. Okay? And then we're going to set identity insert off. So we can't just magically drop things into that table. So this is an example of creating a default data script that checks and updates and ensures that it can be run again and again and again and again and again. And in order to make changes to the actual address types table, you have to add them into the default data script, and you have to add them into the unit test that goes along with it. So let's talk about the unit test real quick. So now that this stuff is done, right, and we know that that works, let's take a look here and look at our old stuff data. Well, okay, so we know that if we try and run this, it's going to blow things up and mess stuff up, and bad things will happen, right? Because we're trying to jam identities in and duplicate primary keys on the address type ID and whatnot. So if we run this, it's going to blow up. We know it's going to blow up. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to get rid of it and say don't save that. But this my person address type over here, I'm going to connect to my local database, right, with a dot and Adventure works, and I'm going to say, hey, I want to run this, and I should see an update back to the name archive, because that's what we're saying. We're saying when the address type ID of 6 equals the address type ID of 6, then update the name, row GUID, and modified date to what's up here in my source, right? So we executed that, and life is good. Now let's see what's over here. We're going to refresh that, and there, it's back to the name of archive. We can run this person address type script 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 100 times. It doesn't matter. It's always going to maintain the data as we expect it to. Okay, so now that we've seen that run and we know why we're doing it and what it is that's going on, to the AdventureWorks project, I added, and you saw me add a post-deployment script in the other project here. Wait, there was a demo of that. If you go back to the last video, you can see it. I added this post-deployment script to go to my default data person address type stuff. And keep in mind too that this script here, if you look at its properties, you'll see that the build action is none. And you can do a lot of things, right? Build action, post deploy, pre-deploy, blah, blah, blah. So you can do lots of stuff with these scripts that belong as part of the deployment. And you'll see the build action for this one is post deploy. And we've just accepted the default data name of post deploy 1. So this script is going to get run as the project post deploys. Now let's make sure that it exists, right? The first test I wrote was the same as the rest of the tests, and you've seen me do this before. So we took a look before and said, oh, well, the database log exists. We're saying that the address type table should exist. Okay, great. Address type table should exist. And then we're going to take a look and say, oh my goodness, we want to make sure that the data remains accurate. And how did I do that? Well, again, like I said before, we start out with a three-tiered expectation that happens inside of our test. We start out with arrange, and then we perform some action, and then we have some assertion that says, hey, this is what it should be, right? So I took the default data out of the default data script over here, right? I took basically this section and copied it a couple of times to say, hey, if actual, right, it exists, drop it, and if expected exists, drop it. And you can expand these to say tempdb ... right, because that's how that stuff actually gets created. And from here, and having an actual table and an expected table. So what are these? Actual means that this is the result of a query that I'm going to run against my actual table. The expected is a table that will have that known good values, that the default data in it. So and then the engine of tSQLt will compare the two and tell us if we're good or bad, right? If life is good or life is bad. In my action, I'm inserting into my actual table here, and then I'm selecting out of my AdventureWorks person address type. Now this AdventureWorks is alias like this because this is a variable that was part of our build, and you can go back to the old videos and you can see how that worked. So that's all good. So let's run this stuff and see what happens. So publish my unit test project. There's success on publishing my unit test project. And then I'm going to go over here and I want to publish, sorry, now I'm going to publish my actual unit tests. And it's going to go through and build everything. And we're good to go there. All right, so that all completed successfully, including the post-deployment script. So let's go back and look at our post-deployment script, which of course is tSQLt.runAll. And here's our results, right? So this is our old test, right? Test database log table exists, that's successful. Test human resources department table exists, that was successful. Person address type table should contain accurate default data, that succeeded. Right? The person address type table should exist. That obviously succeeded. And the should not exist does in fact not exist, also succeeded. So that's an example of testing your default data and writing tests for your default data using tSQLt and extracting the data that you need out of the database, creating your default data scripts, adding them to your post deployment, and then creating tests to ensure that your data exists as it should be. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, check back for more, and we will keep plugging away at learning to use these tools to the best of their ability. Thanks.